SNP spokesman Alyn Smith.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. We don't agree on much, bluntly, but I wouldn't doubt his enthusiasm for the subject. Also, if what he's on comes in powder form, I would be grateful if he'd slip me over some wraps. I think I'm missing out on quite a journey. But it is a pleasure to speak in this debate, much as we disagree with the substance and content of this bill. I pay tribute to my friend from Argyll and Bute, who did much of the heavy lifting throughout the earlier stages of this, and for his troubles was rewarded to metamorphose into our Chief Whip, so he's unable to be here today, but I'm pleased to carry on his work. Because the fact that he's maintained his sunny disposition and his sanity during this process really is testament to his fortitude. Because reading through the proceedings throughout that have brought us to this stage, I really couldn't help thinking that they were some sort of satirical effort written by Armando Iannucci or Ian Hislop, Paul Foot. Let's go back a bit further, perhaps Jonathan Swift or Lewis Carroll. I have very much enjoyed Nusrat in Wonderland, of course, in her presentation, so let's have at it. I'll focus on, Mr Deputy Speaker, our amendments 29, 30, 31 and 33. And we'll be taking to a vote Amendment 28, because we do believe that is worth checking the mood of the House. Absolutely. And we'll come on to the detail of that in due course. But I've never been, and I'll speak specifically about our philosophy in approaching this bill, but also the import of it. And I've never been more conscious of the difference in worldview between the members of the government benches and my party and my country. We did not see the EU as a prison to leave. We did not see the EU as undemocratic. EU laws were passed in conjunction with the democratically elected UK government and the democratically elected MEPs in the Council. The member talked about the codified basis of EU legislation, and he's right in that in codified jurisdictions, but to enter into the domestic legal framework within these islands, they had to be dealt with via statutory instrument. So I really don't think that the starting point of this legislation is correct. Now, we deeply regret, our bona fides, we deeply regret leaving the EU in these benches. My country deeply regrets leaving the EU and voted against leaving the EU.
Hear, hear.
So the fact that we were taken out against our democratic will in Scotland, the gentleman talks about a democratic deficit. There's a democratic deficit in the UK that should worry the benches opposite far more than the one in the EU. Indeed. And I see the smirks, as ever. But it's not just us they're denigrating, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's the people of Scotland. 72% of the people of Scotland in the last opinion poll want back into the European Union. If Brexit has been such a success that we hear about, the UK economy in 2016 was 90% the size of the German economy. It is now 70% the size of the German economy. If anybody would like to prove me wrong in that, these are facts. So I accept the democratic mandate that some of the members are talking about. But in terms of where we're coming from with this bill, I hope that our pro-EU sentiment is respected by the members opposite, because it's deeply felt. This is a matter of deep sadness for us. And deep anger. So I say that in order to be clear where I'm coming from, but I'm not actually interested in fighting old battles. I'm interested in fighting future ones, and we'll be having plenty of those. But I would say to the members opposite, if you will do this damn silly thing, don't do it in this damn silly way. I do not agree with the premise or intent of this legislation, but it's the content of this legislation that's going to come back to haunt this government really fast. In exactly the same way as so many other mistakes which were harumphed to the rafters in this House came back to haunt the very government that tries to deny that it had anything to do with them. Happily.
He makes some very interesting and thoughtful points, but I would just like to ask him, how then did leaving the European Medicines Agency, how then has that come back to haunt this country, given the fact that we were free to invest in a vaccine, creating a vaccine which has benefited others, because we weren't part of it?
Well, I'm glad he mentions that canard that's as often quoted as if the absence of the European Medicines Agency. The European Medicines Agency had 700 jobs in London which were lost from that. There's a starter. There was also absolutely nothing in the UK's response to COVID that membership or otherwise of that Medicines Agency hindered. And I think it really is important to get that point on. It's perfectly legitimate to want to leave the EU. It's perfectly legitimate to want to leave the EU Medicines Agency, but let's not claim successes that were predicated on things that they weren't. So what I find so objectionable about this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that it's so unnecessary. I say I'm not interested in fighting old battles, I'm really not. But for the people who wanted to vote leave and take back control of our laws, etc., well, you won. It happened, get over it. Every single piece. Every single piece. Yeah, they're not so much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, they're not so much bad losers as bad winners. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, every single law, regulation, standard, however derived via the EU channels over the long history of the UK's involvement in it, is subject to this House, is subject to this government.
Yeah.
Right now. Right now. Any legislative instrument that the UK government wants to amend, repeal, bin, whatever, is open to that authority in this House right now.
Exactly.
So in this bill, I think we have a deeply ideological mistake.
Yep.
And I would urge colleagues to, even at this stage, think hard. The fact that we don't know how many legislative instruments are going to be affected by the scope of this bill surely should give a sensible, rational government pause. I don't dispute the idea that a greater complementarity of the domestic statute book is desirable. Actually, I'm in favour of the codification of all UK and Scots law. If the UK had a unified Gesetzbuch, the way the German government has, I look at the member with a wry smile, I think we'd have a far more logical legislative framework. But we don't need to set arbitrary deadlines, which are going to come back to haunt our own officials and government ministers, for the artificial black hole that will open up over various Whitehall departments. This won't give any legislative certainty. It'll give quite the opposite. There will be a chill effect over deeply, deeply held rights. So for those who wanted to take back control, I don't dispute the logic. I don't dispute the idea that if there is a particular legacy piece of EU legislation that is not fit for purpose, well, it's open to the government to get rid of it through the normal legislative process. But this bill is not the normal legislative process, and we've heard much about parliamentary scrutiny. What this bill is a huge blank cheque to here today, gone tomorrow ministers who have demonstrated throughout the Brexit process a lack of foresight and a lack of competence. And the idea that that is a sensible thing to do, and I appreciate there's a degree of scrutiny over the subordinate legislation, of course there is, but it's nowhere near as good as the scrutiny of this House. And that's why we'll be supporting the Amendment 38, which makes clear that this House should be in charge of that process, not the here today, gone tomorrow ministers.
Here, here.
And the idea that the abolition of laws will lead to some sort of dynamism, some sort of freedom, it won't. It'll lead to legislative black holes into which bad actors will expand really fast. And the idea that the UK government is properly set up to take due account of this when it can't even tell us how many instruments are under consideration really should concern those. So I don't like this bill, but I really do fear that the government is making problems for itself, because this is neither rational, nor proportionate, nor pragmatic. The idea that a particular domestic provision, because they're all domestic provisions now, they've all been incorporated into domestic UK law. The idea that they should, because of their origin rather than their content, somehow lapse, is an utterly flawed premise. I shall.
I do jib very strongly at his suggestion of avoiding the procedures whereby these laws were made. It's not just a question of their origin, because it's the EU and some people don't like it very much. It is because of the manner in which the procedures operate.
Which I have to contend is a point on which we flatly disagree. And the fact is, these legislative instruments over 40, 50 years were accepted by the UK government in this House and latterly in the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate and others. They were also incorporated by his government into domestic law in order to provide ongoing continuing legal sentencing. So where there are pieces of legislation that are not fit for purpose or are somehow holding the country back from this brave new world that we're all excited about, get rid of them. But don't say that vast swathes of the legislative instruments on our statute book should just somehow stop without any thought about their replacement or anything else. It is just not a sensible way to go. And these are significant points. And there has been, I accept the point, there has been some hyperbole in terms of what's at risk. I accept that. But what is at risk is fundamental to how the citizens of our countries lead their lives. It's labour rights, it's rights to clean air, clean water, product safety, consumer protection, food quality, protection for women in the workplace, protection of biodiversity, trading standards, health and safety. I could go on. There's a lot more, and colleagues will come on to that. But there are deeply held principles which our party cherished that under this bill will be subject to a reversal process which we reject. So in terms of what we're looking to do and focus upon, our amendment, we will, as I say, support Amendment 36. We'll also support the Labour amendments in terms of workers' rights and elsewhere. We do need a united front on this. But our focus, given we are the SNP, is about Scotland's democracy. Because I believe, and the Minister made a number of points about the increased power for the Scottish Parliament, and there are some powers. But if she's being fully intellectually robust about that process, we also need to look at the interaction of the UK Internal Market Act and the fact that just yesterday a Section 35 order was given by this government. Now, that is implicit in the devolution settlement. That makes clear that the reality of devolution is that anything done by the Scottish Parliament can be called in by the UK ministers. Now, I don't like that, but that's the reality of devolution. But what the UK Internal Market Act makes clear is that any future law of any Scottish emanation of government could be subject to calling in on a political grounds in order to maintain the coherence of the UK internal market. Now, that means every single power of the Scottish Parliament and every local authority, health service, university, all the rest, is subject to a gainsay that upends the fundamental principle of devolution.
Well, Honourable Frank,
happily.
just wonder what his thoughts are about the fact that with the situation he's describing, with those powers being called in, they'd be called in by a minister, not this House.
I'd agree with the point, but I have to say that's the reality of devolution, which is why we think devolution is not suitable for Scotland's ambitions and wants. The Act in question was passed by Labour members, SNP members, Green, Liberal Democrat and 3 Conservative members, and yet has been called in by the Secretary of State for Scotland. Now, we will fight that. We think that's a bad decision, and we will take that right the way through the courts. But the UK Internal Market Act makes clear that any future decision of any Scottish body is subject to the UK Internal Market Act, and this bill makes clear that the past isn't safe either. Existing bits of statute within the domestic statute book are open to reversal as well, and some will fall off the statute book altogether. So where the Minister says that she's keen on more powers for the Scottish Parliament, I really would hope that she'd accept our Amendment 28, which we will be putting to the vote, which makes that explicit. There are opportunities to tidy up the EU elements of domestic statute. I fully accept that. I accept that, and I accept it needs to be done. But it's not done by setting fire to the House because you don't like the curtains in the downstairs privy, which is what this bill does. I think it is flatly a damn silly thing.
Would you give way?
I shall.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. Would he recognise that there's also a commonality in terms of concerns that he's voiced and also approach in terms of not just Scotland but also Wales and Northern Ireland, and that myself and my honourable friends from South Belfast and Foyle and indeed members from Plaid Cymru have tabled similar amendments, 37 and 38 in that regard, and I'm glad he's pushing that to a vote. Would you recognise as well that the capacity of our local civil service to do this is constrained, particularly in relation to the 2023 deadline, and in particular in Northern Ireland, where we don't actually have a functioning assembly? We have a particular challenge where a lot of this could actually drop off the statute book with no one in political charge to actually take any control of the situation.
The member makes a really very important point, and it's worth stressing to colleagues that the UK constitutional arrangements in London, in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland were all predicated upon the maintenance of the single market, the customs union and the EU. That was the balance of devolved competences that was struck. All of this was upended by Brexit and the actions of the UK government since. So there is deep consequence for the devolved settlements in all the home nations of this bill and indeed the Brexit process. So if we're serious about protecting devolution, and I frankly don't accept that the UK government is, in the light of yesterday's decision, but if we're serious about protecting devolution, we have put forward, as have others, ways to protect that. But I don't think this bill is fit for purpose. I disagree with the purpose of this bill. I think it was born of spite and hubris rather than any pragmatic, rational process. I think it will cause problems for the UK government, and I say that with no pleasure. I think it will cause problems for the UK government, and in so doing will undermine the devolution settlement and cause grave disquiet to millions of our businesses and our citizens. If you're going to do this damn silly thing, don't do it in this damn silly way. Thank you.
Dean Russell.